And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. It's available on YouTube, of course, and on Pacifica Radio Network and iTunes and SoundCloud and Progressive Radio Network and most of the other places where you're going to find podcasts. If you want to go see the complete archives, go to opednews.com/podcasts with an S, and you will find over 450 of them there. My guest for this show is Lisa Paglia Skinner. She's a behavioral expert in the field of Alzheimer's disease and other related dementia. In the last 25 years, Lisa has been a community counselor, a regional director of senior care facilities, a trainer, speaker, and private advisor, helping thousands of families and caregivers understand the daunting challenges of brain disease, offering counterintuitive solutions and tools to help people effectively manage the symptoms of brain disease. Lisa holds a degree in human behavior. You can follow her at her blog, Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost, on Facebook, and her book, check it out, Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost. So, great to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And so, talk about, let's get some basics under our belts first. What's the difference between Alzheimer's and other brain diseases and dementia?
That is one of the number one questions I actually get from people. I also lead a support group, and people just really are under the misconception that dementia is a separate disease. I've had so many people say to me, oh no, my mom doesn't have Alzheimer's disease, she has dementia. So let me clear that up because I think it's really important for people to understand. So there are over 70 brain diseases that cause dementia. Alzheimer's is the number one common brain disease that includes dementia. So dementia really is a broad term that's used to describe the symptoms that go along with a brain disease.
What are they?
Let me kind of clarify that in a way that's easy to understand. Most of us have had the flu at many different times in our lives. And when we get the flu, we get a variety of symptoms. Those symptoms can be fever and body aches and chills and, diarrhea. There is just a gamut of symptoms that go along with the flu. Usually that's how we know we have the flu is by these various symptoms. Not everybody who gets the flu displays all the symptoms. They vary from person to person. This is the exact same comparison to people with brain disease. So dementia actually describes the symptoms, but not everybody gets the same symptoms. They range from extreme symptoms to very mild symptoms, and it really depends on what the brain disease is that's causing the dementia.
Okay, so what are the most common symptoms?
The most common symptoms, because of Alzheimer's being the most common brain disease, is short-term memory loss.
Keep going.
And confusion and lack of reasoning and judgment. And inability to task sequence, meaning when we get up in the morning, we know what we do. We perform a variety of tasks, one of which, perfect example, is we brush our teeth. We know we take the toothbrush out of the holder. After we take the toothbrush out of the holder, we run it under the water, then we put the toothpaste on, and there's a series of tasks to perform that function. People with dementia, when they're in their later stages of the disease, they lose the ability to sequence tasks. So they wouldn't know that the first thing you do is take the toothbrush out of the holder, and then step 2 and step 3 and step 4. And this applies to dressing. It applies to all activities of daily living. They lose their ability to sequence tasks.
Now, in your book, you also mention delusions, irritability, easily angered, obsession.
Those are all common behaviors of dementia.
You know, I'm looking at this list and I'm thinking of Donald Trump.
And specifically, what are you asking me?
Well, you know, he's irritable. He's easily angered. He's obsessed. I mean, look at Donald Trump through the lens of an assessment of somebody with dementia. Does he fit? Does he have any of the characteristics? Could he be? People have mentioned it and suggested it.
I've heard that. Yes, I'm very well aware that people are suspect that, and I've actually heard it that it's suspected that he may have dementia.
And what are the characteristics of his behavior that would suggest it?
I would say mainly what I've seen is he gets facts wrong, he gets dates wrong, he gets situations wrong. He mixes up people's names and slurs their names. So these are all things that I've personally noticed that, you know, when you're listening to him on television that come up. But being a behavior specialist, I have to honestly say that I wouldn't necessarily say that that means that he has dementia.
But he's got all those characteristics.
I've seen those, yes, but there are other things that can cause those same behaviors.
Yeah. Okay. But you mentioned a bunch of behaviors that Joe Biden has also manifested, I think.
I've heard that as well. Yes. Same.
I mean, mixing up dates, making things up, getting things wrong, slurring. I mean, it's all stuff that they documented on videos with Biden.
I've seen those. Yes.
Yeah, you know, I have a little background back when I was younger in psychiatry, and there was a term called confabulation.
Yes.
And that's another characteristic of dementia, right?
It's definitely a characteristic of dementia.
So what is confabulation?
It's getting things mixed up and kind of stumbling over sentences and words and garbling.
Or maybe making things up too, to kind of
yes,
fill in.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I want to show a video that we have of Biden. And so here we go. We're going to show this little video and discuss it.
Okay.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
Let's do that one more time.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing.
Okay. What happened there? How would you describe that?
Are you referring to you know the thing?
He started to say, you know, we know these truths to be self-evident, and then it goes, all men are created equal, and he forgot. He just and he just went.
And he said, you know the thing.
Yeah.
That is definitely something that I have seen with people who have been diagnosed with. I'm going to just put it all in one bucket and say dementia. It's a lot easier because there's so many different diseases that cause dementia. And another thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is there's a thing called mixed dementia. So you can actually have a couple different brain diseases going on at the same time. For example, Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. If you've had some transischemic attacks, which are also referred to as mini strokes, they can be doing damage to the brain. That causes dementia and have Alzheimer's disease. So many people actually do suffer from mixed dementia, and there's a couple different things going on. But to get back to your question, one of the things that I do see a lot with people once they get probably to the mid stage and beyond is they do replace the word that they're trying to think of. They cannot think of what the correct word is, so they'll replace it with something like the thing.
Right. Okay, so
That's common.
people kind of, it's not like it's a switch that's turned and all of a sudden people have dementia. It's more like a dial that gets turned up louder, bigger and stronger as more and more symptoms emerge and as the manifests more and more. Would you say that's an accurate way of characterizing it?
That is, that's pretty precise. As a matter of fact, most people, believe it or not, are not diagnosed with dementia until they're pretty much in their mid-stage and beyond, because the behaviors and the symptomology is so subtle in the beginning that it's really hard to pick up whether or not this is a brain disease going on that's causing these behaviors and these symptoms, or is it just the normal aging process, or does somebody all of a sudden have a urinary tract infection? Urinary tract infections are one of the #1 cause of dementia symptoms. Getting a urinary tract infection going untreated can mimic the same exact symptoms as dementia does. But one of the big differences is when somebody has a urinary tract infection, it comes on, the symptoms come on out of nowhere all of a sudden. That's not true with dementia. With dementia, it's a very, very, very gradual process. And that is the reason why most doctors don't diagnose dementia until the person is in their mid-stage.
Now, dementia doesn't discriminate. It hits people who are out of work, and it hits leaders. It hits presidents, and it hits people who have a lot of power. How do we, our culture, deal with people in power who are starting to develop dementia?
Well, that's a really good question, because I'm sure there have been presidents in the past that we might not be aware of that may have had it.
Well, Ronald Reagan certainly did.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with that, but I know there have been others. First of all, you need some kind of a diagnosis. And that is very, very difficult, because even doctors have a difficult time diagnosing brain disease. There are certain brain diseases that can be diagnosed. Vascular dementia is one of the ones that can actually be seen in diagnostic imaging, because again, as I mentioned earlier, it's caused by strokes and also mini strokes. So through diagnostic imaging, the doctors can actually see the damage being done to the brain through what's called brain bleeds. But Alzheimer's disease still cannot be accurately diagnosed through any testing or any diagnostic imaging. The only way you can accurately diagnose Alzheimer's disease is through an autopsy after the death. And what they look for in the brain are plaques and tangles that have formed on the brain, and that's what's damaging the brain. It's like it's suffocating the brain. The brain actually is shrinking. So the best that they can do for Alzheimer's disease, which again is the #1 cause of brain disease and dementia, is do a series of tests, and through process of elimination, kind of whittle down, eliminate other things that could be causing those symptoms. And then their best guess is, okay, I think this must be Alzheimer's disease.
Now that's once it's recognized that the person has dementia, then you're looking at doing tests to figure out what kind of dementia. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and there's a series of mini mental exams that are given to people. They do diagnostic imaging. They pretty much go through the gamut of testing to eliminate everything else.
Now you talk in your book about an attorney who, after his Alzheimer had moved along a bit, he was in a facility, a care facility.
Yes.
Every day he would say, I need to get to my office. And he was not, this went on for 4 months. And then they came up with a solution of making his bedroom look like his office. And then he was okay. But that's a powerful guy, an attorney. I want to get back again. And I'm not just talking about a president of the United States, but a corporate director, somebody who's a manager of a whole bunch of people. How do you figure out that this is going on? What do you look for? How do you make the decision that this person is in need of help and this person can't be responsible anymore because there are delusions and irritability and easy angering and obsession that could all have a dangerous effect on the people that this powerful person could be influencing or affecting?
Oh, absolutely. That's a really great question, and I get it all the time. People ask me all the time, I think I might be getting dementia. How do I tell? And I will respond, well, what makes you think that? And they'll give me examples of, oh, they couldn't remember where they left their keys, or they couldn't remember their daughter's phone number. So there is definitely a distinct difference between normal aging process and the little things that we forget on a day-to-day basis, and the extreme signs, the subtle signs, and then the progressiveness of those signs that really make you raise your eyebrows and say, oh my goodness, I think this is more than just the normal aging process. And the best way for me to explain that is, if those behaviors and those symptoms are interfering with your day-to-day functionability, then it's probably a more serious problem than the normal aging process. When it starts to interfere with your ability to make rational decisions, to use good judgment, there's just so many of them. And again, like I said, different people display different symptoms. The most extreme case I've ever seen was my grandmother. And that was 45 years ago. She is the story in the book. She displayed the hallucinations.
Birds in the bed.
She was believed that birds were living in her mattress. And I would go over and visit her, and she would tell me about these birds in her mattress, and they would come out at night and peck at her face. And she was so convincing. And I didn't know anything about dementia back then. I was a teenager. She was so convincing. I think my mother bought her 3 new mattresses over a period of time, and she kept coming back and telling us, they're back, they're back. So that's what's called a delusion. You believe something that's not true is true.
You know, what really scares me is when you've got powerful people who have really decision-making power, and this is, the knob is being turned up and they're gradually manifesting these symptoms and people don't know it yet. Like your mother bought your grandmother 3 mattresses before she finally figured it out that your mom had dementia. We've got powerful people, and I'm not just talking about Trump and Biden, but there are a lot of them out there. I mean, how many people have dementia?
Right now in the United States, 5 million. And they're expecting that number to double by 2025. Because the baby boomers are a huge generation and we're aging.
So it's going to be 10 million people out of 330 million people.
Unless they find a cure. And they're not close to finding a cure.
Wow.
Most of the research money has been spent on cancer. And so it's going to be a desperate situation.
How long does it take usually from the time that a person starts to have any symptoms at all to the time where they've been really recognized as having dementia? How long can it go?
From when the onset of the very, very subtle symptoms to maybe mid stage when they're not so subtle anymore, and then
to actually recognize and identified as having it.
That can go on for years.
Years.
As a matter of fact, the average time that a person has brain disease that causes dementia is anywhere from 8 to 20 years. My grandmother was a 20-yearer. But the people that I've seen in care homes, I would say the average is, 7 to 10 years.
8 to 20. But how long before they're diagnosed?
It could be several years.
So,
and a lot of people, when the diagnosis comes out, I've seen so many people, including myself, say, oh, there were signs, but they were so subtle that we didn't really think it was anything like a brain disease. But most people, when the diagnosis is finally made, and my mother-in-law, I can tell you, she was one of my 8 family members who had it.
wow.
I remember we all said that when my father-in-law passed away and my mother-in-law, all of a sudden the symptoms just became bold and blatant. And then she was diagnosed, and we all said collectively as a family, there were signs. I remember this and I remember that. And I hear that from a lot of family members.
The video I showed of Joe Biden is one of about over 30 that Caitlin Johnstone put together in an article that was published, and I'm going to put a link with the video, and it'll be it was on let me just get this. It was on Consortium News. Stop calling it a stutter. Dozens of examples of how Joe Biden's dementia that showed but Joe Biden's symptoms. So, the question is, people resist accepting the fact that they have it, resist accepting the fact that their loved ones have it, resist accepting the fact that their leaders have it. How do they do that? How does this denial work?
I see this day in and day out. There is so much denial when it comes to really admitting that you're seeing what you're seeing. When it comes to powerful leaders, I think that we need to, if it is truly happening, we need to not hide our heads in the sand. And as you said, Rob, this disease does not discriminate. Anybody can get it.
Well, let's talk about this hiding the heads in the sand, okay? How do the people around the person who has dementia, how do they go, what kind of denial do they use? How does that look?
Just not wanting to, seeing subtle symptoms and signs, like the ones that you've brought up today and the ones that we've been discussing that just seem off. They're unusual for that particular person.
What I'm trying to get at is, what are the thought processes of the family members, the coworkers, the other people who are involved? How do they deny to themselves that this guy has dementia? What's the thinking? What are the denial mechanisms?
They dismiss what they see or the symptoms that they think are a little off on their loved one. They dismiss it for a long, long time until it becomes so blatant and so obvious that they finally make a trip to the doctor.
And so what are the kind of rationales that they use? What are what's the self-talk? What are the explanations they give to each other? This is not a problem. He's not really got this. What do they say? How do they process it?
Just in that way. I've seen a lot of family members. Usually the family members are divided into camps. A couple of the siblings might believe that their mother has serious cognitive issues. And then on the other side of the camp, there's a couple siblings that say, oh no, there's nothing going on. And this is actually really, really common because I've counseled so many of these families. They just dismiss it. They'll say something like, no, my sister's exaggerating. It really wasn't that big of a deal. Yeah, maybe she forgets this once in a while, but it's not as bad as they're saying it is. I see that.
So is there any kind of a policy? I mean, it seems if they're going to 5 million now and 10 million in a couple of years, there ought to be policies in place that companies, governments should have to deal with the emergence of dementia in a leader. I mean, and dementia can happen in somebody in their 30s and 40s even, right?
Well, that's called early onset dementia. It's actually pretty rare, but that seems to be genetic.
Okay.
Whereas the Alzheimer's disease and some of the other brain diseases, they're not genetic necessarily, but they can run in families. But
when does it usually show up then? What for the most part, what are the age range? What's the age range that you tend to see it?
For actual Alzheimer's or dementia, the earliest person I think that was diagnosed with Alzheimer's was like 30 years old, but it's typically anywhere from, I've seen people in their mid to late 50s with it. But I'd say the average is late 60s and older, 70s, 80s.
Okay. So my question is, are there policies in place? I mean, it seems to me there ought to be, that government and big companies should have policies in place for how to deal with this potential. Are there any that exist?
Well, every state has its own policies and regulations. They vary from state to state. I live in California, and we have certain policies and procedures in place. You have resources available if you suspect that maybe somebody is showing symptoms that are worse than normal aging. You can have a social worker intervene. It's very difficult to get a driver's license taken away from somebody, and people with dementia who drive cars, that's a very dangerous situation.
Driver's license is simple, but running a company, running aspects of government, there's nothing really then that is designed to create any kind of intervention or safety or prevention?
Only when an actual diagnosis is made by a doctor.
Wow. Well, there's a lot of work that needs to be done here.
Yes.
This has been a fascinating interview. Why don't you wrap it up by giving us a summary of whatever you want to wrap up with?
Okay, I think the biggest message that I'd like people to understand is all of these behaviors and symptoms and aggression and hallucinations, not recognizing your son or your daughter. A lot of people, unfortunately, it's really sad, they take these behaviors personally. They think that their loved one is lashing out at them, and it's very hurtful when their mother doesn't recognize them. I think I can't emphasize enough that this is all part of the brain disease, the cognitive decline, and it's all linked together. And the main thing to know with Alzheimer's disease, they all vary a little bit, but since Alzheimer's disease is the #1 cause of dementia, all of these things that we're seeing are directly related to the damage that's being done to the short-term memory. The short-term memory fades in and out throughout the entire process of the disease, but the long-term memory stays intact until the end. So what's happening to people, and it's like a light switch being flipped on and off. Sometimes people's short-term memories are fully functioning, and they're in the same reality that we are in. As the disease progresses, that short-term memory short circuits, or the light switch gets flipped off, and then they revert back to a period of time in their long-term memory. When a mother doesn't recognize her son, you can be pretty assured that when that's happening, she's in her long-term, she's extracting information from her long-term memory. So her short-term memory is short-circuited for that minute of time. It can come back, but the more advanced you are in the disease, the more your short-term memory fades away, and eventually, at some point in the disease, you're living sometime in your past because you're extracting from your long-term memory.
Okay, and we've got a wrap. My guest for this show has been Lisa Paglia Skinner. She's a behavior expert in the field of Alzheimer's disease and been at it for over 25 years. Her book is Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost, and she has a Facebook page by the same name. Lisa,
Yes.
thank you so much for being on the show and giving us some idea of what's going on there.
Well, thanks again for having me. It was a pleasure.